What if the army of the dead defeated the living at the Battle of Winterfell? If you've watched Game of Thrones, you must remember Arya's insane leap the moment she struck the Night King with Valyrian steel, shattering him into a million ice shards. We were all gasping, some of us even jumping off our couches. But what if the dead crushed the living under the Night King's cold, calculated strategy? How would Jon, Daenerys, and the last survivors of Westeros meet their fate? And most terrifying of all, what would happen to the world if the long night never ended? Let's find out. Jon Snow, the king in the north, stood at the top of Winterfell's walls, staring out at the darkness beyond. The Great War had arrived. The White Walkers, led by the merciless Night King, were closing in with their army of the dead. They had come for Winterfell, and with it, they came to the end of the living. But Jon had rallied the forces of the North, the Vale, and the Reach. And with the dragons of Daenerys at his side, he was ready to face the coming storm. Or so he thought. Jon had spent months preparing for this day. He had worked with Daenerys to gather forces, bringing soldiers from every corner of the realm to fight for the North. The Dothraki, with their fierce warriors and flaming swords, were ready to charge into battle. The Unsullied, disciplined and strong, stood ready to defend. And in the skies above, Daenerys' dragons would fight fire with fire, attempting to break the dead's army from above. It was a plan that had to work. It had to work. As the whites began to appear on the horizon, Jon's stomach twisted. The darkness was closing in fast. The White Walkers, with their cold, lifeless eyes, were coming closer with every second. Jon gripped his sword tightly, knowing that once the fighting began, there would be no turning back. He looked to his left where Daenerys stood, determined but equally nervous. Her dragon Drogon circled above them, roaring with defiance. Rhaegal, Jon's dragon, flew nearby, his green scales gleaming in the pale light. The dragons were their greatest hope. If they could keep the skies clear, the whites would be easier to deal with. But something wasn't right. Jon could feel it in his bones. The first wave of whites charged, and the battle began in full force. Jon led the charge from the front, his sword Longclaw raised high. The Dothraki screamed as they rushed forward, their flaming weapons lighting up the night. But as they made contact with the whites, something unexpected happened. The fire that had always been their ally seemed to lose its power. The whites didn't flinch. They didn't retreat. Instead, they kept coming, their eyes glowing with a strange blue light. Jon's heart sank as he realized what was happening. The whites were more powerful than they had imagined. The flames, which had always been the key to defeating them, had no effect. The Dothraki, who had once been a fierce force of nature, were now being overwhelmed. Jon's mind raced. He had never seen anything like this before. He looked at Daenerys, who was battling her own forces in the sky. Drogon and Rhaegal were doing their best to fight off the reanimated Viserion, but the dead dragon was proving to be a deadly opponent. Blue fire shot from its mouth, striking at the living dragons. But even the dragons couldn't hold the line forever. Suddenly, Jon felt the ground beneath him shake as a new wave of whites emerged. The storm, which had been gathering in the distance, suddenly intensified. Jon's mind raced as he tried to think of a plan. The whites weren't retreating. The storm was making it nearly impossible to see the enemy. The fire of the Dothraki was useless against them. The dragons were struggling against Viserion, and Winterfell, once thought to be a safe stronghold, was quickly becoming a death trap. There had to be something they could do. That's when Jon heard the screams. At first, it was just a few voices, distant cries from the back of the battlefield. But soon, the sound grew louder, and Jon realized with horror that the cries were coming from Winterfell itself. The walls had been breached. Jon turned to see a massive white giant smashing through the gates of Winterfell. The sheer force of its attack sent stone flying, and the defenders inside scrambled to hold their ground. But it was clear that Winterfell's walls were no match for the might of the dead. The gates cracked open, and the whites surged in, flooding into the courtyard. The defenders were now fighting a losing battle on two fronts, the battle outside and the battle inside. The Night King, however, was not concerned with the battlefield. His goal was more focused. While Jon and Daenerys were distracted by the chaos unfolding on the walls and in the skies, the Night King had a different plan. He had already anticipated this. He had lured the living into a trap, and now, with the walls falling, he would strike where no one could stop him. Winterfell had long been a place of refuge. The crypts, where the Stark's ancestors rested, were a place of peace and safety. No one had ever imagined that the crypts would be anything other than a quiet resting place for the dead. But the Night King knew better. With a single gesture, he raised his hand, and from the depths of Winterfell's crypts, the long-dead Starks rose. The ancient kings and queens of the North, their bodies once preserved in stone, were now reanimated as whites. The crypts, once a sanctuary, became a nightmare. The living who had sought refuge below ground were now trapped with their own ancestors who had risen from their graves with one purpose: to kill. The defenders who had retreated into the crypts were caught off guard. They had never considered that their own family members, once protectors of Winterfell, would turn on them. But that's exactly what happened. Above, Jon continued to fight, unaware of the horror unfolding below. His attention was still focused on the battle outside the walls. The whites were relentless, and the storm had now become nearly unbearable. The war above was descending into madness. Jon Snow, clinging to his position amidst the chaos, felt the brutal winds howl around him. The battle raged on, but it was clear that the odds were shifting. Daenerys, struggling to maintain control of Drogon and Rhaegal, was now faced with an unimaginable horror. The Night King, standing at the heart of the storm, had executed his deadly plan with cold precision. With two powerful ice spears, the Night King had slain two of the most powerful dragons in existence, Viserion and Rhaegal, who had flown beside Daenerys in countless battles. Jon watched helplessly as the Night King raised the lifeless body of Rhaegal. The creatures that had once been symbols of hope and fire for the living were now nothing more than instruments of death under the control of the Night King. Viserion, once full of fire and fury, now circled above with eyes glowing an eerie blue. His mouth poured the icy fire of the dead. It was a weapon unlike anything Jon had ever seen before. The fire was no longer the cleansing heat of life. It was the freezing death of the whites. Rhaegal, Jon's dragon, was no better. The beast writhed in the sky, its green scales turned to a lifeless gray, its wings faltering as though the very essence of its life had been drained. It was no longer the strong, noble creature that had fought for the living. Now, it was an extension of the Night King's army, a weapon to tear down everything Jon and Daenerys had worked so hard to protect. Jon's stomach twisted as he watched Drogon, Daenerys' dragon, circle in the sky. Drogon fought bravely, but it wasn't enough. Drogon, strong and proud, was battling alone now. The balance of power had shifted, and the living were being overwhelmed, their hopes extinguished one by one. The sky itself was alive with the thunderous roars of the dragons as they fought above Winterfell, the sound reverberating through the air like a chorus of doomed souls. Daenerys was in a frenzy, her eyes wide with fear and fury. She urged Drogon to fight harder, to push back against the growing darkness. But the battle was slipping from their grasp. Jon felt a surge of helplessness. His heart hammered in his chest, his grip on Longclaw tightening. He could do nothing to help. The dragons were all that mattered now. Without them, they stood no chance against the endless tide of whites. The storm above, the battle in the skies, and the chaos on the ground were all blending together into a nightmare that no one was prepared for. And then, it happened. A deafening crack split the sky, followed by a thunderous roar that shook the very foundations of Winterfell. It was the sound of Drogon, the last hope, falling from the sky. Jon's eyes widened in shock as the dragon plummeted toward the earth, its massive wings struggling against the storm. Drogon hit the ground with an earth-shaking thud, sending a shockwave through the battlefield. The living were losing the war above, and it felt as though the end was inevitable. Daenerys, now helpless and broken, dismounted from Drogon's lifeless form. The storm intensified, the winds howling louder, pushing the fighters on the ground to their knees. The whites were everywhere now, swarming over Winterfell's once proud walls, breaching the gates and flooding into the courtyard. The living defenders were scattered, their ranks broken. Jon felt the cold grip of terror settle in his chest. He could see the Night King now, standing atop the walls, his icy blue eyes glowing with victory. There was no more fear in the Night King's face, only triumph. He had won. His army of the dead was unstoppable. Even the dragons, once thought to be the key to victory, were now his tools to command. The battle in the skies was lost. The dragons, once the greatest force of nature on the battlefield, had been turned against them. The storm, the Night King's weapon of destruction, had torn apart their defenses. The living had no hope left. Jon's sword clashed against the cold metal of a white's armor, the sound ringing in his ears. He swung again, his arms growing heavy with exhaustion. The battlefield was a blur of movement, bodies falling, whites rising, and the howling wind that carried with it the stench of death. As the whites continued to flood into Winterfell, Jon fought with every ounce of strength he had left, but there was no victory to be had. The Night King had claimed everything: his dragons, his army, and the very land itself. There was nothing left to protect. Above him, Viserion and Rhaegal circled like vultures, their bodies now nothing more than vessels for the dead. The storm they brought with them raged on, swallowing the last remnants of hope. The sky, once filled with the light of the living, was now a tomb of shadows. Jon felt his legs weaken, his body trembling with exhaustion. The battle was over. Winterfell had fallen, and with it, the North had lost its last hope. Finally, the Night King, unstoppable and cold, made his way to Bran. Bran, seated in his familiar place, opened his eyes. But these weren't the warm, brown, stark eyes we had always known. No, these were eyes that glowed blue, icy blue, the color of death itself. And in that moment, it became clear. Bran had been playing a game much deeper than anyone realized. Bran had been touched by the Night King in his vision all those years ago, and that connection had never truly broken. Bran had become the three-eyed raven, and in doing so had become a participant in the Night King's plan. The Night King, created by the children of the forest, had orchestrated everything: the wars, the battles, the alliances, and even Jon's identity. All of it had been manipulated by Bran's hand. Bran had been the true architect of this madness. Bran had known from the very beginning what would happen. He had allowed the living to believe they were in control, that they had a chance. But in the end, Bran had won. The Night King never cared about the Iron Throne, about the crown. His true goal had always been to make Westeros believe they had won, only for Bran, the Raven, to seize everything in the end. If you want to know more about Bran's true role and how he became the true villain of Game of Thrones, let us know in the comments. We'll dive deeper into this theory in part 2. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more Game of Thrones what-ifs, theories, and stories from the books. Thanks for watching.